Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 50 and 51. Let's begin. Izuku sat on a stool. He thought it might be the same one he'd sat in the other day when Kurogiri and the doctor had questioned him about the quirk. Gigantomachia stood behind him as the doctor went through his preparations. Izuku didn't know what they were, but Dr. Kyudai insisted they were important. The doctor had spent time yesterday testing the quirk and appeared pleased with the results. Izuku had woken up feeling tired, but Kurogiri had given him a hot chocolate and a good night's sleep had given him strength. Besides, he had to be here. He had to give the quirk to his dad. He looked at his father. He was just floating there. The liquid didn't obscure much, and while Izuku knew that his dad had been in good shape, he could see it now clearly. What bothered him the most was the way the mask covered his face, and the tubes went into his throat. That was wrong, but Izuku couldn't stop staring at it. Emergency drain is good, Dr. Garaki was muttering to himself. Nutrient mix good. The doctor taped a few more things into his tablet and then apparently remembered that Izuku was there. He gave him a smile. It didn't look right on the doctor's face. I noticed when you were using the quirk, Izuku, that it took energy. That's why you felt so tired that time. Izuku nodded. So what I'm doing is making sure your father's blood sugars are high enough. And that his body has enough raw material to perform repairs when you give him the quirk. Again, Izuku nodded, though he didn't really know what any of that meant. Now, once you give it to him, don't be afraid if it doesn't activate immediately, Dr. Garaki continued. While I'm fairly certain it's a passive quirk, with his other ones I don't know if there will be a clash. Izuku frowned. How will you know? The doctor looked uncomfortable. Even at 9, Izuku knew that look. He wouldn't know. Are you still watching for loose quirks? Garaki instead changed the subject. There's none, Izuku reported. He wasn't sure the doctor knew how All for One worked. Once it took a quirk, that quirk stayed, unless his dad gave it to someone else. Quirks didn't just wander off by themselves. Kyudai nodded and then continued working. It wasn't much longer before he came back to Izuku. The doctor took a deep breath, blowing it out noisily. You're ready? Kurogiri asked from the corner where he was standing. Dr. Garaki nodded before he looked at the boy sitting in front of Gigantomachia. All right, Izuku, please give your father the quirk. Izuku nodded and closed his eyes as he felt for the quirk he'd gotten in Kyoto. It was stretched over him and he pulled it back into a little ball. It felt odd when it left his limbs. Then he opened his eyes, looking at his dad. The lights were illuminating him, but Izuku's eyes could see the quirks that were there. He pushed the regeneration quirk he was holding towards his dad. It's there, he reported, but kept watching. There was an odd sort of movement in the quirks his dad had. They seemed to boil. The individual colors that represented the different quirks swirled around each other. Some of them disappeared, only to reappear a few moments later. Then everything went still, and Izuku saw the red of the regeneration quirk stretch out over his dad's body. He grinned. It's working, he told the doctor. Good, the man breathed in obvious relief. Even the way Gigantomachia shifted behind him seemed to be happier. Izuku watched with his normal eyes. For a moment, nothing appeared to be happening, then, while it was difficult to see through the liquid, it seemed as if his skin boiled. He'd never seen the quirk work. That's normal, Garaki told him. Izuku felt a wave of relief at that and fixed his eyes on his dad's head. Kurogiri and Dr. Garaki had tried to keep him from seeing it, but there was no way to hide it. As he watched, the skin there boiled, and from under the mask tendrils of flesh appeared. It was kind of sickening but fascinating. Then his dad's body jerked. Dr. Garaki jerked a moment later, then the man rushed to the tube. He taped at the controls. All the while his dad's body was jerking more. There were bubbles escaping from the mask and flesh was forming. It was a bulbous mess. Izuku didn't know if it was meant to be that way. With the way it popped and wreathed, he didn't think so. With the way the doctor was working frantically only confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't meant to happen. He reached out with his quirk. Don't. The word was sharp and Dr. Garaki glared at him before turning back to the tube. If you take it back now. The man didn't specify. Izuku watched as his dad began to thrash. Get him out of here, Kyudai ordered. Kurogiri was slow to respond, but he did, eventually opening to form a warp gate. Izuku watched the tube though until he could see no more. He saw the way his dad's hands clawed at the tube in his throat. He saw the way his hands clawed at the new-formed flesh. But between the fingers, Izuku could see the way the flesh was still featureless. Then blackness covered his vision as Kurogiri surrounded him and he was deposited in a side room. The misty man didn't make any comment and didn't stay. Izuku just stood there, his eyes wide as his memory replayed the vision. What had he done? With Izuku gone, Garaki yelled at Gigantomachia. "Break the glass," he ordered. The large man was quick to respond and the tube shattered. Except Hisashi didn't stop thrashing. "Put him on the stretcher, and hold him down." Kyudai added the order. Again Gigantomachia obeyed and the doctor hoped he would continue. Right at the moment, he did not need threats from an overly protective bodyguard. With Hisashi on the stretcher, Kyudai could work. He yanked the smaller bits of glass from the tube that had lodged in his flesh and nodded as the small wounds healed. Except the man kept trying to gouge his head wound. Kyudai pulled out the tube in his throat and saw that wound heal, but he was focused on Hisashi's head. The flesh had reformed, but it was scarred, and while he was still breathing on his own, his nose was missing, as were his eyes. There were depressions there for eyes, but nothing was there. With Gigantomachia holding All for One down, Dr. Garaki probed carefully. The bone felt solid, and was formed. He ran his thumbs over the eye depressions. There was nothing under them. No eyes that he could cut the skin away to reveal. The same could be said about Hisashi's nose, and his ears were. They were present, but the cartilage and pinna were gone. The ears were just openings. Idly, Garaki wondered if that might give All for One better non-directional hearing. Hisashi convulsed. Gigantomachia growled. It told Kyudai that the large man's patience was running out. Garaki pulled an EpiPen from his pocket. At least, that's what it looked like. This one wasn't filled with adrenaline but with sedative, and he jammed it into Hisashi's arm. The drugs were potent and took effect quickly. All for One stopped struggling as badly almost immediately, and Garaki pulled his hands away from his throat. The skin there quickly healed again, but then his chest began heaving. He wasn't getting enough air. Acting as quickly as he could, Garaki fixed Hisashi's arms down. The straps would not hold if he was conscious enough to use a quirk, but they would do a good enough job for now. Then he grabbed the ventilator's mask. He forced the endotracheal tube down Hisashi's throat, wondering what to do with the nasogastric tube. The normal procedure was to thread it through All for One's nose into his stomach, but without a nose. That couldn't happen. He'd have to make some adjustments. He flicked the machine on and thankfully the flow of moist, warm oxygen calmed Hisashi. Gigantomachia moved away and Kyudai heaved a sigh of relief even as he held the nasogastric tube. Why hadn't the quirk worked? Or rather, why had it worked this way? He thought frantically, but the answer was stupidly obvious. Or at least, he thought it was. If he'd had thought about it earlier, he'd have said he was splitting hairs, but with the evidence lying before him. It was one of the oddities of being able to shift quirks from person to person. Regeneration worked on what was there. It worked perfectly on Izuku because the boy didn't have any injuries when he got it. It restored to what it thought was normal. At least, that's what it appeared to be doing. Dr. Garaki looked at his patient, ignoring the mess that was his lab. There was glass everywhere and the entire place smelt like nutrient fluid. It was going to be a pain to clean up. He grabbed the tweezers from the equipment he'd prepared earlier and pulled out several more glass fragments. The wounds healed almost instantly. What happened? Kurogiri demanded as he reappeared. In his tone was the accusation that Garaki had tested the quirk and nothing like that had happened to Izuku. Hisashi's head was one mass of scar tissue, which was better than not being there but not the outcome they had expected. It appears the quirk has. Dr. Garaki paused as he searched for the right words to describe it. Residual memory. It heals Izuku perfectly because that was the state his body was in when he got it. It did not heal Hisashi correctly because the regeneration quirk recognizes his injury as being normal. There is nothing normal about that, Kurogiri remarked. He didn't say that it should be impossible for a quirk to have a memory, or recognition. It's not the quirk that recognizes injury, Kyudai clarified. It's Hisashi's body. The quirk doesn't know the difference. To it, the state that the body was in when it is put into the person is the state that it returns the body to because that's the template it has to go on. For the original owner, the quirk knew what her natural state was. For Izuku, he didn't have any injury when he took it, so that it took that as his natural state. For one, he didn't have to say anything further. So the Misty Man paused. Why did it heal him? He looked down at his boss who was now lying still on the stretcher. The doctor thought about it for a moment. I think that was his body taking control of the quirk. He shook his head. He didn't want to say the next line, but it had to be said. I don't know for sure. He really didn't know. All he knew was that if they hadn't found something for Hisashi, then he probably wouldn't have survived. It might have taken a week, a month, a year or more, but eventually he would have succumbed to his injuries. This, as bad as it was far better. When will you wake him up? Kurogiri asked. In another few days, Kyudai replied. I want to figure something out with his breathing, he explained. The nasogastric tube was still hanging loose. He thought that Hisashi would also need to be permanently connected to some monitoring devices, as well as drug dispensers. It was going to be a change to his life. And the heroes now knew his civilian identity. That had never been a problem in the past. Hisashi had simply made a new one, except Kyudai didn't think it would be that easy this time. There were going to be changes to his life. He would no longer be able to be the face of his businesses. The pun was not intended. It was hard to tell what Kurogiri's expression was, but the doctor saw him nod. Is this an improvement? He asked. As bad as it looks, yes, Garaki answered immediately. This is better. He sighed heavily and eyed Gigantomachia. The huge man didn't look like he was listening, but the doctor knew better than to believe that. I could have kept him on life support, long enough for him to heal, but infection would always be a real issue, and he shook his head. I'm not sure if he would have healed. Despite how this looks, Hisashi's brain has been restored. But has his mind? Kurogiri demanded. That's what we are going to have to find out, Garaki said. He'd have to run several different scans, as soon as he got the equipment. That was going to be expensive, but he knew, on this, he had an open checkbook. Electroencephalography equipment was not cheap, nor was positron emission tomography, not to mention the magnetic resonance imaging machine. I am going to need the equipment. This is a bit more technical than an X-ray. Kurogiri gave the impression of a shrug. We'll get it, he said nonchalantly. They'd either get it or get Sensei into a hospital to have the required scans. That was probably going to be easier, especially if they went overnight. Dr. Garaki nodded as he prepared a drip and some more monitoring equipment. Hisashi wasn't out of the woods yet, but with the scarred tissue now forming his head, and the bone beneath it solid, he was at least on one of the tracks out. Then the doctor looked at the mess. This was going to be annoying. Izuku looked up at the ceiling. It wasn't his room. He was lying in a cot in one of the spare rooms at Dr. Garaki's facility. It was warm enough and he was comfortable enough, but he felt sick. The quirk should have healed his dad. It should have regenerated him. It did for him. He'd tested it. Tomura had tested it, and the doctor had tested it. What had gone wrong? Izuku screwed his eyes shut and shook his head savagely. Despite the motion, he could still see the bulbous mass of flesh that was his dad's head. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. He swallowed hard and then forced himself to take a deep breath. What had gone wrong? Why hadn't it worked? The quirk had spread over Dad as it had for him. His quirks hadn't reacted badly to it. He'd seen that, but... Shit. Izuku swore. He knew he shouldn't use a bad word, but he couldn't help it. His eyes widened and he felt sick again. He heard his dad's voice in his mind. Your quirk is different from mine. If you keep a quirk long enough, my little dragon, you can't give it away. No, Izuku whispered, bolting upright. He threw the blankets away and staggered to the door. There was a small bathroom attached to the room he was in. It was a closet really, containing a toilet and a small hand-washing sink. Izuku made it to the toilet before he threw up. No, he said, struggling to breathe through the snot that was running down the back of his throat. Tears streamed down his face. He shook his head before he retched again. Could it be his fault? No, he didn't absorb quirks that quickly. Dr. Garaki had checked that for him. His dad had confirmed it. And the regeneration quirk worked on his dad. Except, Izuku shook his head again and spat into the toilet before he flushed it. He felt terrible. Except he didn't really know how long it took him to begin absorbing a quirk. What if he'd kept part of the quirk? Not enough so that he couldn't give it away, but just enough that. Izuku retched again. He choked and gasped and his spit was slick with snot. He forced himself to sit back, ignoring the cold floor as he leaned against the wall under the hand basin. No, he couldn't have kept part of the quirk, because he couldn't split quirks into pieces. The thought was logical. It didn't bring him comfort. I can't have kept it, Izuku whispered to himself, but he wasn't convinced. He knew it by the sick feeling pooled in his stomach. He knew it by the way his throat was tight. He just knew it. Izuku heaved a deep breath and then pushed himself upwards. He grabbed the hand towel and wiped his face. He had to know. He had to test it. He couldn't have kept part of the quirk, but he had to find out. He went to the door of the room and slowly slid it open. He needed a knife. While the doctor had moved with them to Niigata and Saitama prefectures, Izuku had been to this facility often enough that he knew where there was a small kitchenette. He could get one of the doctor's scalpels, but while the doctor appeared absent-minded at times, his equipment was kept clean and ordered. He'd noticed that a kitchen knife would do the job just as well. He only needed to make a little cut. He got to the kitchenette without the others hearing him. Izuku could hear them talking, but he didn't need them to interrupt this. He had to know. Once in the kitchenette, he opened the drawers quietly. It took a few tries to find a suitable blade. Izuku pulled out the knife, and then retreated back to the small room he'd been given to sleep in. Izuku slid down against the door, holding the knife in front of him. This was stupid. He couldn't have kept part of the quirk. He couldn't have. The words didn't convince him, and as if in a dream he flipped the knife blade upwards and then reached out with his forefinger. He paused for a moment and then ran the pad of his finger over the blade. Immediately Izuku hissed and blood pooled and then dripped. Green eyes fixed on the blood and Izuku waited for the wound to heal. He remembered how that felt. Nothing happened. He bit his lip and shook his hand. Flicking the blood off. More welled up from the wound. Izuku felt inside, and pushed his quirk towards his finger. It was an odd feeling, but again, nothing happened. He still felt sick. There had to have been something he'd done. Right now, his dad should be resting, maybe still asleep, but all better. Except he wasn't. It should have worked. Izuku looked at the blood. It was his fault. Maybe he'd only kept the bit of the quirk that healed the head? Did it work like that? He wasn't sure, but he had to have done something. Izuku shifted the knife, turning it to face himself. He set the tip against this cheekbone and quickly slashed it down. The green-haired boy hissed at the pain. He dropped the knife and put one hand to the cut as he stood. It would disappear soon. Izuku walked into the toilet area to look in the mirror. He could feel blood welling under his fingers. The pain was nothing though. He'd experienced far worse at other times. Izuku pulled his hand away, ignoring the way the red liquid dripped down his pajamas. He turned his head to see the cut and then turned on the water to splash the cut. It was still there. Green eyes went wide. It was still there. But he had to have part of the quirk still. That was the reason it hadn't worked on his father. It had to be. The cut still bled, leaving a curtain of blood running over Izuku's cheek down to his jawbone. It then ran forward and dripped from his chin to splash on the basin, onto his pajamas and then to the floor. The blood that went into the basin ran into the plug, staining one side red and pink where the water was. Izuku again splashed water on his face, cleaning the wound so that he could see it clearly. He willed it to heal. It didn't. It remained, stinging and leaking blood. Heal, Izuku implored it. It did nothing except bleed. Tears came to Izuku's eyes and ran down his face. They didn't cut a clean patch through the blood, and Izuku didn't feel where the salt of his tears stung. He simply stared, watching the blood drip down his face. If he hadn't kept part of the quirk, then what had happened? Why hadn't it worked? He swallowed, feeling the bite of bile and snot in the back of his throat. Tears streamed freely and he hiccuped as he bowed his head and slid to the floor, ignoring the blood there that soaked into a new part of his pajama pants. The quirk hadn't healed his dad. The quirk hadn't worked. What did he do now? The man known to the underworld as their emperor looked at his hand. He flexed his fingers, feeling the muscles move and watching the sinew and bone. It was strangely mesmerizing, and he felt his mouth stretch into a smile as he kept moving his fingers. Except, he wasn't the type of man to be distracted for long by such mundane things, and it was only a few moments later that All for One dropped his hand and looked around. The first thing he saw was a white mist, but by the time his head had moved to the other side, his surroundings were familiar. He hadn't been in this room for years. He'd made many plans in this room. When quirks were new. When he was much younger. Oh, he had such plans. This room was his command room. There were plans pinned on boards. Not everything. He wasn't stupid enough to have all his plans laid out, but there was enough there that those he trusted could work on them. There was a map of Japan on the wall. Pins marked it. Only he knew what each color meant. The pins represented friends and enemies. Groups and individuals. He'd moved them both around. Having them fight or just miss each other as best suited his plans. And yet, all for one turned and the room changed. It was now how he'd last seen it. Papers were everywhere. There were bullet holes in the plans, and riddling the map of Japan. The smell of smoke was in the air. There were shouts coming from outside. Petra lay over one of the tables, face down. Blood dripped from her fingers onto the floor. Masao was crumpled in the corner, limbs akimbo. Hisashi didn't linger in his look. He already knew what happened next. He took a deep breath and then everything changed again. This time the location was hazy. It was as if mist was obscuring everything, but there was no moisture to feel and no smell in the air. Hisashi sighed. He was going to do this again. His brother appeared out of the mist. Brother, the greeting was, as always, neutral. Yoichi, all for one, returned it. There was no point in trying to avoid this. He had in the past. Nothing changed. We could just pretend we did it this time. Wait, what? Hisashi looked sharply at his brother. His expression didn't change. No, I don't think you're ready for that, his brother continued, his lips not moving. All for one didn't move. He was happy to avoid this, but it appeared that it wasn't possible. You could be everything they want, Yoichi said, lips moving this time. Hisashi gave him a hard look. This was what he remembered happening. You mean, be their executor, he gave his reply. His brother shook his head. Be better than those others. Show everyone that it doesn't have to end in fire and blood. Show them that change can be controlled, that it is understood and that everyone is human. Hisashi took a deep breath. He looked at his brother. His brother who was weak, and somewhat sickly and who didn't have his gifts. His brother he loved, but who, in this moment was entreating him to be weak. He gritted his teeth. Do you know what they want me to do, little brother? He asked. He still remembered the scorn that dripped from his voice. Nothing that you are not already doing, came the expected response. Even now, his fists clenched. He should have taken back the quirk he'd given to Yoichi at this point, but he hadn't, and that had now led to the annoyances that were the holders. Hisashi put that from his mind. This was time with his brother, and despite the fact they were fighting, and this was a memory, he wanted time with his brother. It is nothing like what I am doing. He objected. His brother looked at him, disbelief evident in his gaze. It's not the same, he insisted. They want me to betray everyone who got a skill. He added. Only those who are hurting people, Yoichi told him. There was the implication that he was one of those people. That's how it will start, Hisashi replied. That's how it always starts, he continued. At first it will be those who have supposedly hurt someone. It will be for their own benefit. It may even be those who can't control their skill and want it gone. Everything will seem fine. It will be fine, his brother interjected. It will show the world that there is nothing to be afraid of. That things can be controlled. All for one shook his head. It starts that way. You remember your history? He asked. His brother better remember his history, he'd made sure he went to school. We can learn from history, his brother replied. It even sounded like he believed that, and if it was his brother in charge, Hisashi would have believed it, but his brother wasn't in charge. Those who would stand against him, those who stood against those who had skills, were using his brother to get to him. They wanted him shackled, and they wanted him shackled in such a way that others with skills would hate him. They'd never say it, but they wanted someone with a skill to then attack him with that skill, and then they wanted him to take it. It wouldn't matter that the action was the best self-defense. At that point, he'd be charged and then, he'd be a slave. At best. They are not prepared to learn from history, Hisashi said sadly. They can't learn unless you are prepared to try. All for one shook his head. Control, he said the word as if it should explain everything. It should. The people Yoichi was representing, the so-called government, only wanted control over him. They wanted his power, they wanted his allegiance. They were jealous of his connections, and he was sure at least some of them wanted the power he had. They claimed to be interested in peace, in equality, in working to bring harmony between those with skills or powers or whatever they were called. And those without them. He knew better. There were those who just wanted to kill those with skills. As if that would stop them appearing. There were those who saw the potential and wanted to control them, who wanted to use those with power for their own gains, and there were those who claimed to abhor those with power, but Hisashi knew what they wanted. They wanted to be one with power. They desperately wanted that gift, and he could see that would be one of the things he'd be ordered to do. They'd find a power they wanted, and then find some reason to demand he transfer it to them. They want control, he said further. Why couldn't his little brother see it? You say that like it's a bad thing. It was his brother's turn to shake his head. Society is defined by control. For society to work, we all agree to be controlled by the expectations, by the rules. And that works when they are applied to all, but you know they aren't. They will be. Yoichi told him. Skills came as a surprise to everyone, but they aren't things to be afraid of. You have to show them that. You have to be someone who agrees to the system, who agrees to the laws. Hisashi remembered how he'd felt at that. It was the same now, though his reasons were different. The first time he'd snarled, and truthfully he felt like doing it again. There was no point in a conversation that never changed. I would agree to the system and to the laws, if they apply them equally. But they don't. They weren't even subtle about the inequality. If you had a skill, then it was guaranteed that whatever the problem was would be your fault. Even when it couldn't possibly be. Humanity had learned nothing. Only the wording had changed. The cows went dry because of the witch. The car failed because of the person with a skill. The words changed, the accusations remained the same. If you show them that those with skills are willing to live within the system, then they will, his brother almost begged. At least, now, and then, he recognized that there had not been equality. No, then they will just use my abilities. We can't do it with the current people and the fear. That's not going to help them accept. It will justify their prejudice. Little brother, if there was any way to do this without bloodshed, I would take it, but I will not be used, and then disposed of. I will not put myself into danger for them. If he did go ahead with their plans, if he did act as their judgment, taking the skills of others, and Hisashi was honest enough to admit that bit attracted him, then he would be the target. Others with skills would target him, not those who should be targeted. He was not going to be the distraction. Brother, please. No. Hisashi turned away, as he had in memory. And history will now unfold. That hadn't happened. What was it about today? All for one world around. His brother had disappeared, and all that greeted his vision was whiteness. Except. Yoichi's voice came from all around him and sounded speculative. Things have changed. I wonder if my nephew can make a difference. Hisashi's eyes went wide. Izuku. But, you'd better wake up soon, brother, because he needs you. All for one jerked and then spun. But the landscape revealed nothing but white. What do you mean? He demanded. There was no answer. End chapters 50 and 51, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Author note. I am aware that the quirk canon calls super regeneration will regenerate any injury so long as it hasn't scarred. So theoretically it should have healed all for one all the way, but I think it has another weakness in that it can't heal the brain properly. Hood cut off his head rather than have it destroyed, so to me. If the brain is damaged, super regeneration doesn't work properly either. After all, if scar tissue was its weakness, couldn't the doctor have simply cut away the scar tissue on all for one's head and let super regeneration take care of it? So there has to be something else at work there. Or it could simply be a plot device to keep all for one weakened. Here, the doctor isn't right with his assumption, but that theory works for now. The correct one will be shown in due course. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.